Welcome to Audiobookish, an audiobook review and discussion podcast looking at audiobooks both big and small, as well as radio plays, narrative podcasts, anything audiobook-ish. This podcast may contain spoilers, rants, curse words, mispronunciations of names and places, and more.
Hello everyone, you're listening to Audiobookish. My name's Fahad Rahman, and as always I'm joined by Poppy Knight.
Hello.
And today we're going to be doing our second in our specials for the British Book Awards. The two books we're going to be discussing are going to be One of Us by Elizabeth Day and Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. And we're going to start off with One of Us. Do you want to read out the blurb for that one, Poppy?
Yes, so One of Us by Elizabeth Day, narrated by Richard Armitage, Oliver Chris, Emilia Fox, Genevieve Gaunt, and Bella Maclean. Martin and Ben were friends for decades. Best friends, Martin would have said, before the terrible events at Ben's 40th birthday party tore them apart. So when Martin receives a surprise invitation back into the inner sanctum of the dazzling Fitzmaurice family after 7 years of silence, he can't resist the chance to get his revenge. Ben has risen through the ranks of power and is now touted as the next Prime Minister. But Martin can't help but notice certain flies in the ointment. Ben's wife Serena, for instance, whose privileged existence is beginning to feel like a gilded cage, or their daughter, Cosima, an environmental activist fighting against everything her parents once stood for. Or the disgraced MP Richard Take, determined to make his big comeback. And then there's Fliss, the Fitzmaurice black sheep, whose untimely death sparks more suspicion than closure. Through their intertwined stories, we see a family and a nation unravelling under the weight of its secrets. With everyone watching, the stage is set for a reckoning. It's time for Martin and Ben to confront what love truly means when everything, family, power and loyalty, is on the line.
Cool. Okay, so this is kind of a trend in this year's shortlist where quite a lot of the books have separate narrators for different point of view characters. I just wanted to have like a quick chat about what you felt about that trend regarding this shortlist. Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, or is it just entirely dependent on like the text of the book that's being adapted?
Yeah. I'd certainly say it's entirely dependent. And I think also you could have the same text and you could make two different decisions, and then depending on how you treat that, it could be the right or wrong decision kind of thing. So I think it's really dependent. And I think it's a really interesting question. And I think that's why we, talk about it quite a lot in these reviews and things. Because, it can be really dependent. But yes, there's certainly a lot of it in this. And I can certainly see the appeal of it. And I think certainly like from the outside, obviously I'm certainly not saying that, the judges is a shortlist or anything outside of the audio industry. Of course they're not. Yeah. But if we're just talking about kind of, popular trend, maybe people who are outside, maybe people who don't listen to many audiobooks, I can certainly see why it seems like that would always be better, right?
Yes.
How it would seem like more narrators, always better, more immersion, stuff like that. Whereas I think there are a lot of cases where that isn't true. And actually one really versatile narrator tells it really well, or just doing it in a different style, as in more of a I'm being read to rather than an I'm getting access to this as it happens in real time. Those are very different experiences for an audiobook, and so a big bit of the decision is what are you wanting from it, and there'll be things in the text that'll maybe sway that, kind of like is it first person or third person might be something. I think it's interesting in this we have one first person perspective and then a lot of third person, but very much through their eyes, so that's interesting. So I very much think it's dependent. I think it can, even when it's the right choice, it can be not done very well, but often it can be done brilliantly, and stuff like that. So, and I can also see why, it always seems like a better thing, especially if you can, like in this instance, you can get a load of big names attached to it, you know? That's always going to be appealing for people to listen to.
I think that's, I mean, we kind of touched on this in the previous episode, kind of this other trend for bigger voice or bigger name actors coming in to do these audiobooks, kind of the advantages and disadvantages that can have in terms of having to pick up lines, and also especially when you've got multiple point of view, and this is something I want to pick up later. Sometimes when you do have these multiple point of view characters or performers coming in, making sure there's like consistency across the different characters as well. I think that's something that affected this book a little bit. Let's talk about the book itself. The central characters for me in this book were Martin and Cosima. So Martin is this, he's a former friend of the Fitzmaurice family. He went to private school with Ben and they were fast friends together. They had some sort of falling out, and now Martin is planning his revenge against the Fitzmaurice family for this wrong that was done to him. One of the things that I felt going throughout the book was that I was missing kind of quite a lot of background. Elizabeth Day does do a good job of like catching you up as to why Martin would feel so wronged by the Fitzmaurice family, but I didn't know anything about the book going in, and it's only later on I discovered that it was a sequel to one of Elizabeth Day's previous books. So I think she did a fairly good job of like filling you in as why the characters had these relationships with each other, but I did feel like I was kind of like missing like certain maybe nuances or undercurrents that was going through that. In terms of like the vibe of the book, and this is something I wanted to kind of ask you about, it felt very kind of like posho, upper crust, rich kind of white people intrigue problems. Is that something you maybe would agree with?
Oh yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
I found it very difficult to connect with any of the characters.
Yes.
And this was what I was hinting at in the last episode when you were saying about, even if you dislike a character, you want to have a reason to be interested in hearing their story.
Yeah.
And sorry, going quite harsh out of the bat, but I really didn't. And I still think by the end of it, I don't care about any of them. I don't like any of them. Some I dislike more than others, but I don't like any of them. But I also really wasn't interested in them, in what they thought their troubles were. I'm not saying they didn't have troubles, but very much that kind of vibe, right? Which I then found it hard to connect with. And it's interesting as well with what the blurb says and how you were sort of describing there about Martin, how he wants to take his revenge. And it's something that is, I don't think it's spoilers to say, mentioned later on, that he goes on about, and this revenge, and it was such a big part of my life. And I remember being a bit surprised at that point, because I was like, was it? Because it felt to me like he sort of just stumbled into situations, rather than plotted
actively
revenge.
Planning,
and rather than revenge being all he dreamed of ever. And so I find it interesting that that's how it's kind of blurbed, and that's how it's described in some bits of the book when that wasn't really what I got. And so I wonder maybe was it the subject matter, and maybe I was never going to get interested in the subject matter or the characters, or maybe I was prejudiced against them. I don't know. Or was there maybe more could have been done to make the intents, the motivations, the thoughts of these characters more compelling. I kind of felt a lot that, we sort of get introduced to each character in turn, and they have quite long, kind of like, I don't know, they're like 45 minutes to an hour, I think, chapters with each of them, just kind of to introduce them. And it felt very expositional, I think is the word. But there was just a lot of like, okay, and then this is the case, and I feel like this, but like nothing happened. And I found myself sort of like, it's something between like 2.5 to even 4 hours in, being like, okay, but what's happened though? You guys have told me a lot, but what? So I guess bouncing off your initial thing, I definitely agree with that as a vibe, and it is something that I found difficult to connect with the book because I wasn't sure what I was that interested in.
Yes, I mean, I kind of agree with you. I do agree with your point there that the early chapters are quite expositional. I do feel it did move on the story more than I think it did from your point.
Possibly exaggerating a little.
Also, your point about Martin being maybe a little bit of a passive character. The way that I interpreted that was that he's almost like a coiled viper waiting for his moment to strike. I think one of the themes of the book that's quite deeply explored, or maybe not deeply explored, but certainly is explored, is class differences. One of the things that Martin kind of repeatedly mentions is that if you're someone in power, you don't really suffer any consequences. And I think I did a little bit of reading around like what happened in the and kind of what happened in the previous book is also kind of explained in this book as well. Maybe that feeling of like powerlessness to kind of affect any change or getting a revenge, and maybe he was just waiting for his revenge there. In terms of like Martin's character, I think Richard did a good job of embodying kind of this low level contempt Martin has for everyone. So I think that came across very well. And I also think that kind of Martin is, I think at the start of the book he's like a closeted homosexual still. And Martin talked about his like sexuality and this feeling of really wrong. I think those sections were kind of particularly well done. I felt they're done with a great deal of like sensitivity. There's that as well. Apart from Richard, we've got Emilia Fox.
I did also, just before you jump to that though,
Yeah.
obviously interesting, and I think worth noting, given that we're talking about these in the context of the shortlist, that two of the books shortlisted are narrated by Richard Armitage.
I way preferred his performance in this book to the other one. Yeah. How did you feel?
Yeah, I don't know that I'd necessarily say that either performance was better or worse, because I think I thought he performed both
I just
really
dislike
quite
that
well.
character so much, man.
That might have been it.
Yeah.
But no, I think it was really good. And I think, it's telling, he's, even outside of these two, he's done a lot of audio projects recently and stuff like that. And I can fully understand why people want to listen to him. I think he's fantastic. I think something that was interesting to me, and I wonder if you've had this or not had this, because I know we've spoken a bit before about people's voices being associated then with audiobooks.
Yeah.
And, I have listened to things that have been narrated by the same person, but never basically one after the other. Or I think I had one book in between. I think I listened to Beautiful Ugly and then Cursed Daughters and then this one. But within a short space of actual real lifetime. And I thought that was really odd, because obviously I had to take a while to get my brain right, and I had to try and remember, or intentionally forget, if you will, what was the other character and what was this one. And I wonder what your thoughts were on how that's maybe different or similar to actors that we see doing different roles in film or TV. Because, obviously for audiobooks as well, except maybe a TV series, you spend a lot more hours than you would with a film with them. And certainly very one-on-one. And also with just hearing, and as versatile as it absolutely is, but just hearing the voice, and so not seeing changes in physical mannerisms and stuff like that. Yeah, I wonder what you thought about the sort of the separation between character when it is that same voice.
Track back to your previous point that he's making in terms of listening to the same narrator kind of quick session. The only time I've ever done that is when they're narrating the same series. But obviously there's not that kind of changing character that you need to kind of get used to.
Yeah, you want to keep it the same. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I didn't have that much difficulty switching the character in my head, because they were such different characters, and the way Richard performed them was so different. I can't even remember the name of that pathetic man in the in the previous book, but he was just like a wet sock sort of thing going on there, where Richard as Martin, there's more steel in his voice and his performance there, and more venom as well. So I didn't have that much difficulty, but yeah, it was kind of quite interesting, and it did make me realise it can't just go in there with a set thing. You need to go in there with your preparation done and understanding how the character would speak and kind of understanding the text a great deal as well. Yeah, it's
also, I do find it interesting that you say that they're such different characters, because now this was at the very beginning of me listening to it, because it's right at the top of my notes, but I'd made that point and I'd put, they also seem to be a kind of similar character. So I think that's funny that we're sort of interpreting that differently, and because I could draw some parallels between the two of them. I could see some difference as well, but I could sort of draw some parallels too.
Yeah. I mean, they're both sort of fragile white men, maybe need to move on a little bit.
And they feel very wronged.
Yes, well, they feel that they feel very wronged.
Yeah, and a kind of, are we meant to sympathise with them or not? Is this kind of sympathy worthy or pathetic? Or
Martin's
it's
a very strange fish.
Yeah,
I felt. Even if he was wrong, then he was completely 100% in the right. I just found his sort of his mixture of contempt and pining over the Fitzmaurice family really odd, man. It was really strange. It was I didn't really know what to make of that. The other thing I wanted to kind of maybe touch on a little bit was that a lot of the characters in the book, while well written to a certain extent, and all the performances I think in the audiobook were really well done. I particularly liked Oliver Chris as Richard. I mean, I was maybe losing a little bit of patience in this book, because I was thinking, what's going on? Then Oliver Chris comes on as Richard Tate. It's oh, who's this guy?
Yeah,
this is something a little bit interesting, but
and it's so different as well. So just to pause you there, because I think that's something that I'm sure in reading it on the page you'd also notice a bit of change in style. Yeah, but it's really obvious when it's in audio. You go from a lot that sound very, I don't know if sound similar, but very much it's the same kind of tone of book. Yeah. Almost like we were kind of talking, or I was saying for Beautiful Ugly, how if it had been narrated less darkly, until some of the bad stuff happens, you could be, forgiven for thinking it was a much lighter book with just a bit of a dark backstory. And so, you have quite a lot of dark mellow. And then this guy comes in and he's really bright, and it is really jarring, but I think in quite a good way. And I think it is interesting how much then that character massively stands out from all the other characters.
A lot of these characters were slightly cliche, even though they were kind of well written. We've got the gay man hiding his sexuality. You've got the extremely rich MP. You've got his frustrated wife, his rebellious daughter, Richard Tate, this kind of like bumbling Tory MP. So it did feel like, cliches are reason these are characters you can put into a box and move around and make things happen. But I was just wondering if you maybe felt the same way about them being a little bit cliche, kind of like stock characters.
I think so, possibly, yeah. And I think, there certainly was some nuance there. And, I think, almost again, I think the most interesting one was Richard Tate. Yes, and kind of the idea that he has some very negative qualities and some almost redeemable qualities. And, that was probably almost, I think, the most complex character. Not that there weren't complexities to the others, but I almost felt like they weren't really developed well enough, maybe. But I certainly think you certainly could put into boxes, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But I think that will be the case. In
terms of like the complexity of the characters, maybe feel like Fliss was also she's the character you spend the least amount of time with. So it's Fliss's death that is the catalyst for the events in the story. Kind of like her passing away and her funeral is what brings Martin and Richard Tate and Cosima and Serena together. Serena's kind of looking for revenge against wrongdoing that her husband has done, and as is Cosima. So Ben is kind of like sort of portrayed as quite a contemptible character in this book, and he there are certain things that do emerge during the story that make him very unlikable. And it's at this point that I feel like one of the things I disliked about the story quite a lot, and it just made me feel really gross. There's like, and I think we do probably need to put like spoiler warning / trigger warning. There are two kind of like really gross, maybe three quite gross depictions of rape in the book that made me feel really, really like uncomfortable. And I was having kind of quite a good time listening to the book, and then those sections come along and thought, this is no fun. You didn't really need to go into that much detail. I was just wondering how you felt about those sections, and I don't want to say exploitative. It wasn't like exploitative, but it just, Did you feel it went into maybe like too much detail? I don't know.
I think I think I'm in agreement with you with it. I've got written down here like really awful and unpleasant, not what I come to my fiction for, and just made me very unhappy. Yeah. And I think that's the thing, in that there certainly is a place for being open and explicit about it, and those topics absolutely need to be addressed. And we talked with the last shortlist for the speakies for I'll Never Call Him Dad Again, how important through books it is to express these things. And obviously that was non-fiction, but I absolutely believe in the power of fiction to also talk about these things. And and sometimes the explicitness, the bare truth of that is absolutely necessary. But I think we're both of the same impression that in here it more felt like a plot point and a way to elicit a reaction from a reader, more so, I'm not saying it didn't, but more so than being a really important part of the cultural conversation. I kind of felt if it was going to be a really important part of the cultural conversation, it needed to do better. The book needed to be a bit more about it. I wonder if maybe, it's just kind of just coming to me, but I wonder if maybe one of the issues with the book is that it tries to do too much. It tries to tackle too many of the problems. And maybe this is also a metaphor for government. It's trying to fix too many problems that it's actually addressing none of them. And that maybe actually focusing on some of the, deciding what issues does it want to talk about and actually talking about them properly to make it not seem like these bits were used they felt more used as plot devices, more as, oh, there's an appetite for this at the moment. You know, we're getting more and more books that have explicit sexual content. You know, there's very much the rise of more erotic fiction, more kind of like in the romanticities and stuff like that. For, you know, there's certainly an appetite for more explicit sexual content in that sense. And I think that's also then carrying over, both with this book, because not only the rape, but also a lot of other instances, as well as other things we've had on this shortlist. There's a lot of just very explicit sexual, like, out of nowhere. I know it's a slight tangent, but I do wonder how much that's connected to then that rise of more erotic stuff. But then does that mean it should bleed into everything necessarily? Does that mean that people in other genres are trying to appeal to that? I don't know. Yeah. But I guess back to my other point, and sorry, I know you wanted to jump in, is just that it felt very much like, you know, well, there's a lot about sexual content. There's also, I think, a lot about rape and sexual assault in a lot of fiction at the moment. And whether it's actually serving it or whether it's just like, oh, yeah, that's Vogue at the moment, which feels very awful. I'm not accusing this book of doing this, but I'm saying it felt more like that than it did that it was worthwhile, if that makes sense.
The thing is that I hate using the sexual assaults that happen in the book. They're a really important plot point, kind of like what happens in terms of the character development and the plot doesn't move forward without those things happening. Mm-hmm. And I think what I think the book was trying to address is, you know, issues around investigating cases of historical sexual abuse, you know, men protecting their mates, you know, the inadequacies of like police investigations and kind of like, I mean, there was awful lot of strands I think she was pulling out from different headlines in order to kind of like put the story together and kind of explore those different things.
Maybe sort of slightly connected with that is that I do think there was one instance where it was graphic and uncomfortable, and as I say, that may not be what I come to my fiction for, but sometimes that's a good thing to make you feel uncomfortable. There was one instance where it's kind of the sex itself was consensual, but then stuff that happened in it wasn't. And I think that was quite a good description. Like, don't get me wrong, I didn't like it, but I think it was quite good actually that we saw, and I don't see this that much, so I think it was more, whatever the word is I'm looking for, to actually see that perspective and see how it affected the woman involved and how she was very much kind of like toying with herself, was like, was that okay? Was that not okay? Wait a minute, now I see this person very differently. And I think that example I had more time for. I know exactly what you're talking about. The second one, I don't think we needed to go into as much gross detail. But even that first one, it did make me feel very like mucky and uncomfortable. Just to say, I think I can see why this was nominated in terms of just like the strength of the performances from all the narrators. The story's okay. The one thing I did find a little bit frustrating was, everything kind of rushes towards the end, kind of, events gather pace. I did not for a minute believe the character progression in the climaxing chapters of the books. I just don't believe the characters would have done the things that they did in the way that they did them. I just don't believe, for me, this is like, you might as well be writing about dragons and unicorns fighting over, a sea of fire. That would have been more believable than these characters making some of the decisions that they did. I felt she was trying to tie it into quite a neat bow and kind of set up the third book in this series. I was just wondering, I know you're kind of like quite hot on like maybe not having quite high standards for finishing chapters of the books. I was just wondering how you felt about that one as well. No, I think we're in agreement, and I think I finished the book and was like, what? I was just like, oh, right, we're done now? I think I agree with you with the ending, but obviously I'd spent the rest of the time listening to the book after I'd sort of, I guess, made my opinion up quite early on. So I guess I was sort of primed to not be that impressed. But I found that, and it was really interesting actually what you said there about not believing that. I think there's an element of that, of just how much do or don't we believe that people can change, that I think is in there.
Come
but
on,
I
dude,
fully
there's
agree with
limits,
you.
bro. There's
Exactly. No,
you know.
I do fully agree with you. But also the point I was wanting to make, that as well as that, which is a valid thing on its own, I think it's quite telling of the looking at it from a writerly perspective, from the fact that it's a book, from that kind of artifact, because it made me think about one of the things I was least happy with. And basically, the impression this book gives me is that it was very plot driven. I think my impression of it, could be wrong, I see a world where the author very much had in her head what was going to happen, storyboarded it, knew what was going to happen. And then the scenes were written to get from A to B through C, D, E, F, whatever. That doesn't work for the alphabet. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It felt like that. And to me, that meant it felt kind of weak. So we sort of talked a bit already about Martin and revenge. Wait a minute, how much was that actually a big deal of his character? I think what you say there about the end, and I think also one of the things that really got me was, and maybe, you know, I'm just not perceptive enough, but that the whole catalyst, as you say, being at this funeral, I think this is early enough that this isn't too much of a spoiler, but is this idea that it is not called a suicide, but the guy who knew Fliss just before it happened was like, it was a suicide.
Yeah.
And it's really vital to the plot for anything to make sense that this is seen as really suspicious.
Yeah.
Whereas in those circles and the attitude that so many people have towards suicide, I wasn't suspicious at all that the family were covering up that it was a suicide.
Yeah.
There doesn't need to have been anything else suspicious behind it for it to be, oh yeah, they're not admitting it's suicide, because there's so much shame around that and so much stigma around it that to me didn't warrant enough suspicion for the rest of the book to happen, if that makes any sense. So it's a bigger point, and I could go on for ages, and I do have a lot of notes here of both big and little things that, you know, maybe I would do differently, or maybe I'm not quite happy with, or could talk about for ages. But yeah, I guess my overarching thing would be that I think it ties a lot of the things together, is that I feel like the book tried too hard to stick to a skeleton of what was going to happen, rather than letting the characters and the story itself almost dictate what was going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, I think I probably liked this a little bit more than you did. It did keep my attention throughout. I mean, it kept my attention once Richard Tate was introduced. I was just like, I want to find out what happens to this guy, what this guy does. And like I said, I do understand, just purely on the strength of the voice performances, the narration performance, why it's been nominated.
Yeah, I think interesting to say that, and just to bring us full circle back to what we began with, and especially you saying about the inconsistencies with characters.
Oh yes, God, yeah, that's one thing I did want to kind of like pick up. Like, everyone has got different accents for everyone else. Yeah,
and it's interesting because in the write-up for the shortlist, it even says how, you know, they were committed to consistency, providing each narrator with a list of accents that featured in each chapter. But I'm not sure that then became what happened in the end, is my perspective on it. And potentially, you know, it's the fact that the word accent, so, you know, say out of thin air, well, certainly say this, a Scottish accent. You know what I mean? Both narrators can go in there being like, I'm going to do a Scottish accent, and the people will sound completely different, you know, and that's why it's often really important to send like prep clips of the narrators before recording. So each of them do a bit of narration in their character's voice, and then the others have got to try and mimic that. Or if that's going to be impossible, you're going to adjust what that first person's doing. And so, yeah, I feel really bad criticising it and stuff like that, especially when it's something that was clearly aimed for. But my impression, and I'm guessing yours as well too from what you've said, is that didn't really work. You know, I thought Take's Martin wasn't the same and seemed a bit off. And then this isn't necessarily a not the same, but Serena's Jarvis I hated. I didn't enjoy listening to that at all. Yeah. And obviously, you know, we're not going to enjoy listening to him, but I didn't enjoy that. Yeah. No, that was weird.
So yeah, any final thoughts?
A very quick final thought, a positive, I think, from this book. I will say, because I've been very negative, but a positive I will say is that I find it interesting that even with this many characters, I felt like Ben was a character whose perspective I'd heard from, even though I had never heard from his perspective.
Yeah.
And that I thought was that was an interesting thought that the book left me with, was that, wow, if you asked me, without me thinking too deeply, I would have said that he had a perspective and he had a narrator, but he actually didn't. We only hear him from everyone else, and that was a really interesting thing about the book. But yeah, I think there's certainly some strong performances in there, even if, I have nitpicky things about accents or voices or whatever, but really strong performances in that sense of, like, audibly I enjoyed listening to it, but story-wise, it wasn't for me. And as I say, I think it's a mix. It probably wasn't going to be for me anyway, and maybe it's not my taste. And then there are some things where I think I would think it could be done better. And whether that's actually objective, it could be better, or whether it is subjective to me, I don't know. Yeah. But yeah, that's what I have to say, I guess.
Okay, cool. So we're going to do Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, adapted by Lulu Raska, Dion Edwards, and Morgan Kibbe. Grab your sisters and cinch those corsets. This is a retelling of Jane Austen's beloved Pride and Prejudice like no other, performed by a remarkable new cast with an original score. Elizabeth Bennet has no intention of settling for any man, or frankly, any life that isn't lived entirely on her terms. She will marry for love, dance when she wants to dance, and if at all possible, find a quiet spot to read without being interrupted. But she's introduced to the wealthy and completely insufferable Mr. Darcy. Everything she thought she knew comes into question. Get an intimate glimpse inside Elizabeth's mind as she reckons with what it means to stay true to oneself while opening your heart to new possibilities. Starring Marisa Abela as Elizabeth Bennet, Harris Dickinson as Mr. Darcy, Marianne Jean-Baptiste and Bill Nighy as Mrs. and Mr. Bennet, and Glenn Close as Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Okay, so the first note I've got on my thing is that this is not an audiobook. It's a radio drama, audio drama, whatever you want to call it. Like British Book Awards, like what are we doing here? It's not an audiobook. It's an adaptation. I don't know how you feel about that.
So, I think it is a radio drama.
Yes.
But I won't necessarily go as far as you are as to say that it's not allowed to be in the category, because I think it is very much that thing where I'm going really, really wide scope here, but like categorization is such a tricky thing. Yeah. I feel like I've spoken about this on the podcast before, but there's a lecture at uni that was talking about that and kind of how we perceive things and how we put them into categories. And chair is a really bad example of an apple, but it's still like, where do you draw the line as to where it's not? That's going to sound mad without me explaining it, but let's not waste too much time explaining it. But there's this idea that it's really hard to categorize anything with firm boundaries outside of it, And I think, if you say that the fact that it isn't word for word in the book, okay, but there are, and certainly used to be, a hell of a lot of abridged audiobooks. So in what sense is it not an abridged audiobook? And okay, well, it's really immersive with all the sounds and you've got a different narrator playing different characters. Yeah, but a lot of really immersive audiobooks do that. And it does have a narrator in it, but so do a lot of plays. And so I think, it's one where I do think it's an audio drama. I certainly think if this was serialized on BBC4, I would not be surprised. It absolutely fits that. And it very much calls on that tradition, and I think in like the best way. I think you've probably got a lot of people working on this that have worked on radio dramas, and that talent absolutely comes through. So, I think if you asked me to say what it was, I would say it's an audio drama. But there are blurred lines, and especially, the bookseller doing the British Book Awards is very much industry awards. And it's very much talking about the industry, and this is packaged and sold as an Audible exclusive as an audiobook. And so in that sense, the market has got, or I guess the people who published it, have said it is an audiobook. Yes, it is very much radio drama, but it's also showing that kind of shift of how people are consuming stuff, and that now that audiobooks are having more growth, and people are consuming them in more, block sitting / their own pace rather than serialized across things. Now, obviously, radio dramas were then put on CDs and people that consume them however they wanted. But I think the inclusion of it is sort of it's reflective of how things are moving, and it's interesting. And it's an interesting one that makes it very hard to compare it to others.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say it's not that it shouldn't be in the category, but if you were describing it to a friend, you'd say it's an audio drama.
Yeah, I think that for me, where I kind of maybe draw the line between audiobook and audio drama is if you've got two voice actors or narrators kind of like interacting with each other. And I just also felt like the level of sound design was also a big factor. But let's kind of move on from that point. I read Pride and Prejudice like a very, very long time ago. So like for me, there's also a joy of like rediscovering this text. I've not seen any of like the TV series or films. So like my only preconception was like when I read it when I was maybe like 18 or 19 years old. Pride and Prejudice is such a well-known text. There's been so many adaptations. I was just wondering how you felt about those colouring your interpretation of this one, or if you had any of that coming, kind of like any of that baggage weighing on you before you kind of listened to this adaptation.
Yeah, so I know that I have seen the Colin Firth one, because I know that my mum loves it, but it has been a long time since I did. I think I may have read it, again, because I know my mum loves it, but if I did, it was a long time ago, and I may not have actually. Yeah. And then similarly, I think we may have watched the TV show, but if we did, it was a long time ago. So, I do have knowledge of it, and there were certainly lines, especially in the beginning, that I recognised. Yeah. They came to me. It was like, oh, like if you'd have asked me to tell you them, I wouldn't have been able to, but then they happened, and it was kind of like a deja vu sort of thing. So yeah, but I've been I haven't read it for such a long time, haven't been around it for such a long time, that I felt like it was a mix of going in very fresh, but also having some preconceived notions. Yeah. And very much just, of what we hear it talked about. And kind of, I'll be honest, very much how that blurb sort of says it. It's very much like, I'm sure I'm getting the era wrong, but what it makes me think of, and I guess almost that's the point of that, I might be getting it wrong, is like Regency romance. And that's all it is. And that it's very much just, balls and romance.
Yes.
So I was then really interested by so many other dimensions that I think are in the book.
For me, so one of the things I have in my head when I'm listening to, or I imagine like Jane Austen kind of Regency romance, is two characters having yearning for each other. And like for me, it's kind of like how that yearning comes around is kind of like quite important as well. And I don't know, like for me, I think kind of Lizzie Bennet's and Mr. Darcy's relationship in this one, one of the things it mentions in the blurb is an intimate glimpse inside Elizabeth's mind, and I didn't really get that in terms of understanding how that yearning develops. And I think one of the issues we have in terms of like translating things from the text to the screen or the text to audio, when you're missing out on these like maybe text which is kind of telling you what's going on in a character's mind, you can kind of display that visually, and I didn't really get that same sense just from like the audio performances there. I was just wondering if you had any comment on that.
I don't know, I think I'd probably agree more that it does give a really kind of a really close look into her mind, but I think it's funny because it's more through what's unsaid in a way, and kind of because she's an unreliable narrator. And so that's what's really interesting, because she's saying one thing, and by her saying that is revealing that what she's actually thinking, maybe even she doesn't know it herself, is something else. That is kind of the crux, really, I guess, of the story. And I really liked that. It sort of links as well to one of my favourite bits about it, as a very specific example, when she gets a letter from Darcy and she's like, I'm going to stop reading. There's a beautiful extremely perfectly timed pause, and then he comes back in with what's written on the page. So clearly she has kept reading. I don't think I explained that well. It's because kind of, it does the thing, rather than her voice narrating what she's reading, it was his as if he was writing it. And I loved that. And then, like, not very long after, there was, "Oh, I should rip it up." Pause. And so the next bit of the letter. And I really, I loved that, because I loved that was that kind of thing of she's trying to convince herself of one thing, but she's so intrigued by the letter, even if nothing else, even if no other feelings, she's so intrigued and she's against herself. So no, I thought that was, and you know, you see it from her perspective, and that is a very, in that very intimate way of what she's thinking or telling herself that she thinks, and and you hear it. I felt it was quite intimate with Lizzie.
Okay, let's talk about the performances. I thought everyone in this book did an absolutely fabulous job with their performances. I think from top to bottom, it's kind of quite obvious just from the level of performances that we're getting why why it's been nominated, even though it's in the wrong category. Why it's been nominated. I think kind of like Marisa Abela's interpretation Elizabeth Bennet was quite interesting. I don't remember, and I'm going to swear a little bit now, sorry. I don't remember Elizabeth Bennet being quite as cunty as this in kind of like the in the book, or kind of like in short snippets of the TV series and films that I've watched. How did you feel about like her kind of interpretation and her performance of that particular character? Because it's the linchpin of the book,
Yeah, I thought it was absolutely brilliant, and it definitely does make me want to seek out more stuff that she's done. I put that she has a very seductive voice, which I think is which I think is very true. And
it's very kind of like
also,
teasing, isn't it?
Yeah. It's absolutely. Which makes it enjoyable to listen to. And I think leans into what you're saying of that interpretation of the character. And I wonder, as I say, with not knowing the source material very well, I wonder how much of that, with you saying you've not seen it in other interpretations, is that it's kind of a new thing, or how much of it is that the other interpretations were very much like, oh, in olden times women wouldn't have been like this, and they've almost put a bit of a filter on it. I think there's stuff, I'm not an expert in this by any means, but I think there was certainly a period of history where a lot of stuff was sort of more censored and more toned down than actually it really was, and actually it was a lot filthier and stuff like that. I would think we were sort of talking about this, or maybe it was just in her book, but with Katie Kennedy and the stuff she's doing about history and stuff, and actually it was quite sassy and sexy and all that kind of things.
Raunchy,
and so that's
stuff,
something and that's something I'd be interested to see, is that, like, was it in the source material, but when people have been adapting it, they've been being like, no, let's make it more civilized, or is it something that is new to this, or is it something that was in there but we don't recognize it as that as much, because what this has done is made it more like what we now see. Maybe there's something in the tone of voice and the way that we speak now that's been adopted in this that wouldn't have been them, but it would have had the same coding as what would have been then, or something like that. So I certainly think it makes it very fun to listen to.
The other thing I kind of quite enjoyed about this is that you probably, I shouldn't assume, but this is very like this might not be your experience with like your family, but a lot of this is very, like, for me, Asian family coded, kind of like the internal like family politics of parents wanting to get their daughters married off, and kind of making sure that what this auntie is saying about this daughter, or what that uncle saying about this nephew, and kind of like the gossip and the importance of reputation and honor, which is kind of quite an important. Do we need to give spoilers for like Pride and Prejudice? Do we need to give a spoiler warning?
Probably not. I think that's probably okay.
You're probably okay. Kind of like so for example, talking about the joys of rediscovering old books, one of the characters I'd completely forgotten about is this despicable, wonderful villain, Mr. George Wickham, and how he kind of like he comes into the Bennet family life and just kind of wreaks havoc with his duplicitous nature. And one of the main plot points is Wickham kind of eloping with the youngest sister Lydia, and kind of how that action has potentially doomed all the sisters to being basically unmarriable. And it's Mr. Darcy's kind of act of generosity that really, I don't think it solely turns Elizabeth's head, but it's kind of one of these actions that really cements the fact in Elizabeth's mind that Mr. Darcy actually properly does want to be with her. One of the things I've kind of seen online, and I wanted to kind of get your take on this, is that there's this ongoing thing online in terms of trying to reassess characters and whether or not they've got autism or not. And I've seen maybe a couple of threads about Mr. Darcy potentially being slightly autistic in the way that he approaches people. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that at all.
I think I have thoughts, but I don't know how much I have to say that. I've also seen the similar kind of conversations. I'd seen one that's talking about the rhetoric from some people of, oh, back in my day people didn't have, and I saw a retort from someone that was like, oh yeah, so Jane Austen just came up with Mr. Darcy completely out of nowhere, then did she? And stuff like that. So it's certainly something that is discussion about, but I don't feel like I'm best placed to say it. But yeah,
it's really odd. I quite like this book. I don't have that many notes on it, apart from the fact that whereas with one of us had loads of stuff that I wanted to kind of discuss, which is maybe a little bit of a shame. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the sound design. I thought that was really superb. Kind of, it's got original score, original music. I felt there were, I can't remember where it was. It's kind of maybe during one of the many walks that takes place in the books. I felt like the use of maybe wind, highlighting tension between Mr. Darcy and kind of Elizabeth, heighten that tension, things that they want to say to each other but aren't quite ready to say yet. So I just felt that really added to the level of engagement that I got from it. I was just wondering if you had any comments on that.
Absolutely.
As well,
I thought it was brilliant, and I thought, I completely agree with you on those use of sound effects and the use of music, the score, and the fact that a lot of the time in sort of film score, for example, the best ones are when you don't realise there's music playing.
Yes.
And it is, and it's quite loud, and it's quite obvious if you actually thought about it, but you're so immersed in the scene, and it so beautifully matches the tone, or even guides the tone, that if someone asked you, was the music in that scene, you couldn't say for certain. That kind of feeling. Yeah. I think this does incredibly well. It's very much like a film score. It is very much used like that, and I think extremely well. And I also love that it then plays on itself, because there are some things that you might think are the score, but actually they're the music in the real scene, and it stops abruptly and stuff like that. I think that kind of, I think it's like diegetic and
non-diegetic,
stuff like that. That I thought was really clever, and that also brings some real humor in it. And similarly as well, the fact that the sound effects can give humor. It's predictable, but it's still funny. You know, when mum says, "Oh no, it's not going to rain," and then sure enough, there you can hear the rain. And I thought that was really funny. So I think brilliant. I think really immersive. I think a lot of the overlapping audio, especially in the beginning when it's sort of like that kind of busy atmosphere and everyone's talking over each other and stuff like that, really good. So not only the sound effects, but what they have done with the narration that they've recorded in terms of post-production, also just brilliant. I like that there's, whether this is performance or post-production, I don't know. My guess would be some post-production. I do think there was a subtle audio quality difference when it's Lizzie's narration or her thoughts versus her dialogue.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case, yeah.
Yeah, and I thought that was really, really good. And subtle, but absolutely does the job, where it could, in other worlds, be trickier to tell the difference between the two. So I thought that was absolutely brilliant. I can't really, really fault it. If I had to try and find a fault, I think I found sometimes that the transitions between the scenes were then quite loud, and then it changes quite quickly to another loud different scene, but that was kind of more in, I guess, in the fact that they were quite short scenes, and that's something that you get when you're adapting and you're abridging, so it's not necessarily criticism. It was something that I found less pleasing in listening to it. But when my bar is really, really high, it was just like slightly below that as like I'm not sure I love this, but because I loved everything else. I thought it was absolutely brilliant.
I thought it was fabulous. I really enjoyed listening to this adaptation, and the performances across the board was great. And it's kind of Jane Austen's, I don't know if you've read, when I was younger, I did go through a little bit of a spree where I read kind of quite a bit of Jane Austen. She is such a brilliant writer, and like you don't stay relevant and popular without kind of really touching on like these universal human emotions and human truths that a lot of people feel. And it's kind of that weird thing about this being, a period piece, really kind of specific, but that specificity giving a universality to kind of the story and the characters as well. Did you have like any particular favorite performances in the book?
Oh, performances!
Because I do have one.
I think Lizzie's was fantastic, but I also thought everyone's were really, really good. Maybe more characters than performances, but what were you going to say about performances?
I really enjoyed Marianne Jean-Baptiste's performance of Mrs. Bennet. I mean, she's like a classic character. She does some kind of like quite cruel things to her daughters. She says some quite mean things to her daughters, but there's this, I really love the way that she performed that role. And you really got a sense of, even though you might not necessarily agree with some of what she said, you can completely understand like her motivations for why she's doing the things that she's doing. And I recognize like a lot of my aunties and my cousins in like the way she kind of performed. So I was always saying that about that person. Oh, that person's never going to come back into my house again, and all that sort of thing. So I really enjoyed that aspect of the book.
Yeah, no, I think that's very fair. And I think that certainly like rang very true. As I say, limited memory of, but that rang very true with what memory I did have of that character and stuff like that. And I think that's very much kind of a classic. I guess we were talking about interpretation. It is the way that she is to be, but it was done incredibly well. I very much enjoyed Mr. Bennet. I think performance wise, as I say, I think they were all very good. Ironically, if there were any that I thought missed the mark slightly, sometimes it would possibly be that one, where some of the lines felt a bit more like I could see him in the studio reading the book and wanting to go for his lunch. But some of them, others I thought were really good. But I really loved that character. That was one where I loved his relationship with his wife, how they bounce off each other, how them being so different. But on the surface, it seems like they hate each other, but in a way that can only be if they actually really love each other. That I really liked, and especially his relationship with Lizzie and how, he's so supportive and everything of her, I thought was lovely. And as well, that was some of the humour. I thought a lot of the funny lines came from him. I genuinely laughed out loud because it really caught me off guard when he's telling her stuff and Lizzie's just kind of repeating the last few words of what he said back to him, and he goes, I'd hoped you could have formed your own words in this conversation. And that bit absolutely made me laugh. And there was a lot of other humour in it, either in like funny lines or in the funny situation or in the, you're laughing at the characters. Oh, you silly Billy, why are you being like that? When there are so many words, if you are abridging something, then you've got to be really choosy as to what you pick and keep. And I loved that the humour absolutely was in it.
It's an interesting point you kind of like make about the adaptation. I'm just kind of a quick Google about the unabridged audiobook and how long that would run to. So they're saying between 11 and 12 hours, and this one comes in, I mean, there's one version that's 14 hours and 3 minutes, and this comes in, just under 5 hours, I think?
I think it was like 4.5.
4.5. So it basically whizzes by, and it does make me like wonder how they decided to cut out and adapt the bits that they did cut out and adapt. But this is an absolute if you're fans of Jane Austen, if you're fans of Jane Austen, this is a really, really good adaptation. I think Marisa Abela brings something unique and charming and kind of frustrating yet adorable to the character of Lizzie Bennet that I quite like. For me, I can't highly recommend this enough. I had a really great time listening to this.
Yeah, I did as well. I really, really liked it, and I found myself wanting to come back and listen to it, really compelled to. and I found it really calming. I think it's the world's real stressful at the moment. Even if, you know, everything in your own individual life was going fantastic, the world is going to pieces. So especially if everything in your life is not going fantastic, it's real stressful. And I found this really calming. I think a mix of the skill and the immersion of the audio, as well as it just being quite calming. The performances as well, calming but also so skillful and immersive. And yeah, the story, you know, I mean, what is it to say that hasn't already been said? I'm so nervous of saying anything on the story because it's like millions of people have analysed it to death. But I really enjoyed it. I really love that stuff you were saying about the family. I love the family dynamics of it. I love the fact that, yes, it is a love story, but so much of the story is about Lizzie's relationship with her mum, her dad, each of her individual sisters with whom she has a very different relationship, and with her friend, you know, and that was so much. It was so full of interesting things. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Really recommend it.
Very highly recommended from the both of us.
One other very quick thing I wanted to say about this is that I love that we get full credits at the end. And maybe this is a hangover from the radio drama kind of thing, but I think it's one that absolutely should be carried over to audiobooks, because a lot of time we just get kind of full cast. And I appreciate that it's long, but people can turn off if they want to turn off. I really love that it has the full credits of all the narrators in there, because everyone deserves to have themselves recognised. So yeah, just another thing I wanted to say on this. But yeah, absolutely recommend it. Think you should definitely listen to it.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much, Poppy. This is the second in our episodes about the British Book Awards audiobook fiction category, and then the next books we're going to be covering are The Long Shoe by Bob Mortimer. I've already got thoughts on that. And then The Rosefield, which is the third in the Book of Dust trilogy by Philip Pullman. Watch out for that one as well. Okay, guys. Thanks, everyone. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.